Tonight, you arrive in rain-soft Paris in the year 1793, a medical apprentice of the Faculty of Medicine descending each evening by lamplight to the Catacombs to measure femurs, tag skulls, and study the quiet order beneath the city. If you enjoy this gentle journey, please consider subscribing. Now take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's begin our calm descent through chalk-cool passages and careful ledgers, where lime dust, printer's ink, and the geometry of bones settle your thoughts into rest. You awaken in the narrow attic above the printer's shop, and year 2 arranges your morning in small, careful sounds. Lime dust drifts through the shutters and settles on your sleeve like pale pollen, a quiet reminder of the stone quarries beneath the city and the work awaiting you at dusk. Below, the hand-press answers its own rhythm with a soft rasp and a breath, the platen rising and falling as if the shop itself inhales ink. The bells mark the hour with measured clarity, and on certain days they also ring for civic festivals, their cadence folded into the new calendar that keeps step with reason and the seasons. You sit up and listen for the faint brush of paper stacks being squared, for the clink of type in its drawer, for the muted conversation of apprentices who speak in low voices as the press comes to life. A draught moves gently under the eaves, smelling of rain and iron, and you tie your hair back, thinking of the descent you will make later, when the city darkens and the bones wait in their cool order. Rue Saint Jacques carries learning and trade along the same stones, and you walk it each day as if along a slow river of ink. This street has long served the colleges and the Sorbonne's precincts, joining lecture halls and libraries to the practical shops where letters become objects and ideas become commodities. Printers and booksellers cluster beneath hanging signs, their windows set with type cases, pamphlets, and sheets printed in handsome Roman and austere italic, while engravers display copper plates that flash faintly when the sun finds them. The thoroughfare runs south through the Latin Quarter toward the old road to Orléans, and its history shows in the uneven paving and the persistence of bookstalls that have weathered kings, parliaments, and reforms. Carts roll by on damp stones carrying rags for paper mills, barrels of lampblack, and bundles of proofs wrapped with twine, and the drivers speak to their horses as if discussing a lesson. When you pass the Sorbonne's walls, you notice notices posted in neat columns and handbills pieced over handbills, the street itself becoming a palimpsest that records the arguments of the city. Your supper remains plain, and conversation follows the bread with a steady, reflective gait. At a small table, you and the other students share black bread, a slice of cheese, and thin wine, and the talk moves gently to liberty, equality, and the rights of man, not in shouts, but in the steady current of daily speech. In year 2, measured from the autumn equinox and the new republican calendar, Paris speaks of consolidation and suspicion, and many institutions receive new names crafted in the language of utility and virtue. Churches become temples dedicated to reason, streets acquire titles that honor civic values, and festivals are recast to praise agricultural abundance, fraternity, and the nation's guardians. You mention that funerals and commemorations now often bear republican emblems, that processions align themselves with the months newly christened after weather and harvest, and that the bells, when they ring, announce both the hour and the civic mood. The wine is thin but sufficient, and the cheese smells of straw, and the words continue in the background like a familiar refrain that keeps company with the evening. Your apprenticeship places you in the new language of medicine, which is built from observation, demonstration, and measured description. At lectures, you learn to enumerate findings, to classify signs, and to give the body's systems a vocabulary that can be shared, revised, and tested. Paris's hospitals, Hôtel Dieu by the cathedral and La Charité closer to the river's bend, organize the day around bedsides, case notes, and the steady work of surgery, where experience counts as evidence and comparison becomes a method. You hear how teachers revise the curriculum to privilege what the eye can see and the hand can verify, how demonstration gains authority over speculation, and how numbers, pulses, temperatures, dimensions help connect patient to pattern. Desault's practice at the Hôtel Dieu is cited as a model of operative precision and clinical teaching, and you are told that very soon a younger voice, Bichat, will propose a tissue-based way of understanding anatomy that will reshape the field. The words are not delivered as prophecy but as guidance, and you carry them with you as you weigh bones and trace their measurements with a string drawn taut. The garret serves as study and refuge, a small room ordered to keep the mind clear. A crate holds your notes, folded by topic and tied with cord. A borrowed compass rests beside a chipped cup, and a length of twine hangs from a nail, smoothed by your fingers from repeated use. A short list of Latin terms, ossa, sutura, foramen, lies pinned to a beam above the table, and you look up at it without thinking, the words now part of the room's architecture. The press below contributes its steady punctuation, and every so often you hear the careful thud of the frisket closing, and the thoughtful squeak as pages are hung on cords to dry. Your day arranges itself accordingly. Study at the desk by the window until the light withdraws. A slow walk to the entrance on the left bank, and then descent by lamp to the ossuary where the air is cool and chalk dry. You return by lamplight through streets damp with evening, remove your coat, and read a page or two before you sleep, the twine coiled inside your palm as if the hand were remembering a line. Paris wraps itself in a steady soundscape that accompanies your routine and keeps the hours gentle. Carts go by with iron-banded wheels, their sound softened by wet stones. Songs drift from doorways in refrains that praise the Republic, the lyrics familiar enough now to join the bells as part of the city's ordinary music. From the workshops comes the low industry of craft, the shuffle of paper sheets, the tamping of ink balls, the dry whisper of sand scattered across fresh lines to help them set. Lanterns lift and lower, marking doorways like calm beacons, and the scent of oil, glue, and water carries up to your window in a mild sequence that becomes as reassuring as a hearth. You think of the hospitals folded into this same soundscape, their courts and corridors shaped by footsteps, murmured notes, and the distant clink of instruments laid out with care. In this arrangement of tasks and noises, nothing feels extraneous. The city keeps time not with alarm, but with repetition that makes learning possible. Your tools and your street teach the same lesson, and you hold that lesson quietly as the evening draws near. A printed page demonstrates how form is preserved by pressure and spacing, letters kept in line so that a reader yet unborn may receive a clear impression in a distant room. The ossuary demonstrates how form is preserved by stacking and sequence, bones placed in measured rows so that their relations can be read, without disturbing the silence that protects them. You think of type sorted back into its cases, each letter with a compartment, and of tibiae and skulls arranged with similar care, each bone returned to a counted place. You will descend soon with your twine and compass, just as the journeyman below prepares another form, tightening the timpan and checking the margins for clean impressions. The work of both crafts, printing and anatomy, converges on the same purpose, to arrange what endures so that the living can read the past without needing to raise their voice. You descend by lamplight into the old stonework under the left bank, following galleries first opened when Paris was still called Lutetia. The rock here is a fine limestone that once built churches, townhouses, bridges, and defensive walls, extracted steadily from the Middle Ages onward until the earth above began to falter. By the later 18th century, sinkholes and subsidence troubled the quarters around the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, prompting officials to survey and shore up the emptied seams. At the same time, the ground of the city's busiest churchyards had been worked and reworked until it could absorb no more, most notoriously at Saint-Innocent, where overcrowding made burials a matter of public health. Complaints spoke of smells and damp walls, and of pits so saturated that the soil itself seemed to turn liquid, leaching into neighboring cellars. In response, the authorities resolved on a combined solution: retire unsafe quarries to civic use and relieve the surface by transferring the dead below. From 1786 forward, bones were moved in stages by night, in covered carts and quiet processions, the aim practical rather than ceremonial, hygiene for the living, and a new order for the remains. As you enter the ossuary in 1793, you find it already functioning, though not yet arranged into the formal vistas that will be made more elaborate in the early 19th century. The galleries are supported with masonry where the original pillars need help, and cross walls have been built to retain stacks so that air can circulate between them. Rows of tibiae alternate with bundles of smaller bones, the larger serving as stable faces while the miscellany is housed behind, kept dry by the geometry of the pile. Plaques mark the origins of transfers, Saint-Innocent, Saint-Laurent, and others, some noting the year the carts arrived, each inscription a brief ledger of the path from churchyard to quarry. The air is cool and chalky, with a dampness that gathers on your sleeve, and the steady drip of groundwater settles into a rhythm that guides your steps. In the cone of your lamp, the chalk walls glow, and the galleries recede in measured arcs like pages in a book. Access is controlled through official entries, and you nod to less carriers who tend the props, and to municipal guards who keep the passageways clear, their presence as regular as the markings left by surveyors. Your work begins with the plain tools of your craft, instruments chosen not for grandeur, but for repeatable measures. A string, knotted at regular intervals, helps you lay out spacing. A measuring rod and a folding rule give you lengths. A small set of calipers lets you compare diameters and curve. You lift a femur and note its head, smooth from years of motion. Then set the shaft against your rule to add a figure to your growing column of averages. Skulls receive tags made from scraps of stiff paper, inked with the likely origin and, when the evidence permits, an approximate era. You judge sutures for fusion, inspect wear along molars, and glance at the outline of the brow and jaw. In your notebook, you keep a quiet taxonomy of details. an extra cusp on a premolar, a healed fracture thickened with new bone, the shallow groove where a muscle once pulled, each observation translated into words and numbers. You align every stack with care, leaving small openings for air and setting the base on a bed of rubble that drains, a habit taught by quarrymen and adopted by physicians who have learned that dryness is as important underground as cleanliness is above. These habits belong to the language you have been taught, the Enlightenment preference for what can be counted, compared, and classified. Natural history has offered a model, species arranged by observable traits, charts of variation drawn from many specimens, and you carry that logic into your measurement of the human frame. Averages promise something useful, perhaps a guide to typical proportions for making instruments or a baseline for recognizing disease. Yet even without grand conclusions, the figures themselves feel instructive, facts that stand on their own. The municipal program that created this ossuary follows the same ethos, addressing the nuisances that had become intolerable at the surface. Odors in hot weather, contaminated soil near wells and cellar walls, even the collapse of graves into neighboring properties, by centralizing care of the dead. Instead of many churchyards, each struggling with space and drainage, the city concentrates remains where ventilation and masonry can be managed together. You learn to read the marks of that plan in the stone, a newly bricked support, a date scratched into a retaining wall, a level line drawn in charcoal to keep a stack true. In committing each detail to your notebook, you take part in a civic routine that promises cleanliness, stability, and a record that can be consulted. Even so, the bones never become mere entries. They hold the quiet texture of lives that touched fields, workshops, and kitchens. A chipped molar suggests years of coarse bread and grit in the meal. A rounded groove on a humerus hints at labor repeated until it left a signature in bone. You turn a radius that bears the smooth callus of a break well healed, and you imagine the long recovery that followed, the body returning to its duties with a slightly altered stride. A cranium with worn incisors tells of habits formed at the mouth's edge, thread bitten and pulled, or tools steadied at the lip, an economy of motion that left its trace. The measurements proceed with calm, but your hands recognize shape as memory as much as geometry. The arc of a rib speaks of breath, and the shallow cup of an acetabulum speaks of walking streets that now lie only a few meters above your head. You tag, note, and place these pieces within the order you have been asked to uphold, aware that the system exists to be consulted, audited, and expanded, a living ledger in a city that has chosen to manage its dead. By the time you finish, the gallery around you is tidy in its own quiet way. The lines you have pulled from rule and string now visible in the way the stacks sit. A ledger stone receives your chalk mark, a small sign that this section has been measured and set. Your book receives a number that will return you here without confusion if asked. You smooth the facing bones until they are square to the passage, testing for the firm, give that means they will hold, and you check that the small vents between rows remain open. The lamp throws a soft halo, and the drip in the distance sounds like a metronome stepping off the length of the corridor. Somewhere behind a masonry buttress, a carrier's pick taps once, then rests, and the air settles into its usual cool, mineral calm. You practice your art of order with patience and trust, believing that careful arrangement can keep the ground steady and the air sweet, and that from visible, countable facts, understanding will follow. You return to the surface for the morning lecture, and the anatomy hall receives you with its clean, deliberate order. Washed tables gleam under high windows, glass jars are aligned by size, and instruments rest on cloth squares, each labelled in a neat hand. A slate waits at the front, with columns for ratios, length to breadth, circumference to diameter, so that each demonstration becomes a lesson in proportion rather than spectacle. The lecturer speaks evenly about causes that can be seen or measured, tracing a tendon's course with a pointer and pausing for you to note attachments in Latin. You write coronal, sagittal, and lambdoid while your fingers steady a compass, and you measure a radius twice to confirm the number you will carry into your notebook. The emphasis remains patient and clear. Evidence first, description precise, conclusions only as firm as the measurements allow, as if language itself must be squared and balanced before it can be trusted. In this atmosphere, surgery in Paris stands ascendant, and the wards of the Hôtel Dieu serve as an immense clinic that feeds the curriculum. You join a demonstration where Pierre-Joseph Desolles insists on a case history set out in sequence, age, circumstance, signs, and the operative plan, so that what is done today can be repeated tomorrow by another hand. He tests bandages by tension and direction, explains a ligature with careful geometry, and pauses to have a student recite the steps back to him. The hall does not applaud. It copies, weighing each motion as data, and you learn to see procedures as arrangements of causes and effects. Your notes adopt a stable pattern: date, place, specimen, measurements, condition, remarks, so that no observation stands apart from its context. When you glance up at the slate again, the ratios resemble quiet sentences, statements in a language you are just beginning to speak with fluency. Allied fields press in with the same cadence of reform, and their vocabulary enters your routine. A chemist like Antoine-François Fourcroy outlines a rational curriculum in which substances are named by composition rather than habit, and you hear echoes of that clarity in the way bones and muscles earn their positions in your index. In the hospitals of Bicêtre and the Salpêtrière, Philippe Pinel is soon to advocate careful observation and humane restraint, asking that behavior be recorded with the same steadiness you use for anatomy. You absorb these currents without fanfare. List what is seen, avoid conjecture beyond what the body offers, and let classification serve understanding rather than authority. Between sessions you practice converting old units to new proposals, turning lignes and pouces into decimals as if thought itself must be laid out in tens. At your bench, a straight edge and compass guide proportionate sketches, and you mark sutures like cartographic borders, as though each skull were a country with legible, lawful edges. Institutions move as you study, and their motion sets the terms of your day. The former faculty of medicine is pressed to modernize, its lectures pruned, and its examinations made to favor practicable knowledge, and you hear that new schools of health will soon replace the old frame under a Republican mandate. The change feels less like rupture than like recalibration. Wards are transformed into classrooms, case books into public archives, and anatomy into a discipline that binds observation to service. In the amphitheater, comparative anatomy becomes a lens for proportion, human to animal, normal to variant, and the late 18th century's appetite for quantified description gives you a template for thinking. You calculate averages for femur lengths from different stacks of specimens, and you mark out departures from the mean with small stars. When a lecturer mentions that hospitals must become laboratories of evidence, you understand the phrase in your hands as well as your ears. Each ligament you identify becomes a line in a ledger intended for common use. The promise is practical. If knowledge is shared and measurable, then it can be taught, repeated, and improved without reliance on rank or tradition. Your days hinge on repetition and quiet attention, and the geometry of mortality below ground meets the geometry of knowledge above. Calipers that weigh lightly on a tibia at dusk serve again at dawn to check an ulna before a demonstration. The rhythm of measuring, recording, and confirming unites both spaces. In the hall, you sketch the pelvis from 3 angles, tracing arcs with the same care you use when you align skulls into a symmetrical wall, and you note how each procedure depends on naming edges and planes. The slate collects ratios for the thorax, the ossuary collects squares of bone, and in both places you are asked to make the past legible to the present through alignment. You learn to classify, not to reduce, but to make observations portable, so that they can travel from a garret to a hospital to a quarry turned ossuary without losing shape. Even when a tray of specimens arrives unscheduled, you take its contents as you take the city's rearrangements, streets renumbered, weights and measures standardized, the calendar's days retitled, as signs that order is a discipline, not a single act. Evenings in the garret you copy figures while the smell of ink rises from the shop below, and your supper sits beside an open notebook. A straight edge steadies your hand across coarse paper as you repeat the proportions of a vertebra, marking processes and notches with letters that correspond to your legend. Your fellow students eat and speak of liberty as if it were a hygiene of the body politic, a way to remove the fevers of privilege by airing out institutions and bringing light to closed rooms. They praise reason as a remedy for superstition and debate how teaching must change to serve citizens, not corporations of guilds, and you listen while adjusting a circle on your compass to match a known measure. When they ask your view, you answer with particulars. An improved bandage described, a table kept clean, a case history written so another can use it, because you trust the concrete over what cannot yet be tested. As the candles burn lower, you finish a proportional sketch, and the margins hold the words you bring from below. Alignment, repetition, and the patience to return to the same object until it yields its shape. What you learn in this season is not only a catalogue of parts, but a posture toward the world, and the catacombs make that lesson tangible. Rows become ideas, and ideas become tools, and the steadiness you practice among stacked bones follows you into the amphitheatre where plane and angle guide your eye. You learn to accept that averages describe a field, but never the full contour of a single life, and that ratios clarify without replacing the thing measured. In both settings, you notice small variations that refuse to be absorbed, a suture that deviates, a curvature that is not in the diagrams, and you record them without haste. The work asks you to honor regularities while attending to exceptions, to keep a ledger that welcomes detail rather than erasing it. Standing at the back of the hall as the lecturer closes his notes, you recognize a quiet truth that settles deeper than any theorem. To study anatomy is to practice humility, because however exact your figures become, each body remains particular, variable, and once alive, beyond reduction to number alone. A new delivery arrives under plain canvas, and you set your lamp where the light falls evenly across the trestle. You untie the knots, steady your breath, and lift each crate lid with the care your instructors demand. What meets your eye does not shout, yet it speaks in small technical details. A film of connective tissue, where time usually leaves only clean articulation. A sheen at the joint surfaces that has not yet dulled, and a faint metallic note in the air that lingers after your lamp flame shifts. You note that the outer tables of the skulls show no polish from soil or long abrasion, and the porous bone at the ends of several long bones has not softened as it does with years underground. These are the indicators you are trained to observe, and you write them in your ledger without adjectives, adding measurements of length, breadth, and curvature, as if each line might steady your mind. The crates are labelled with the familiar assurance of municipal order, and you pause before the painted words as you turn the page to begin the next entry. Official stencils on the boards name the old churchyards, Saints Innocents, Saint Laurent, sites that the city has been clearing for years to relieve the press of the living. You record the labels faithfully, then set them beside the condition and the contents, letting the contrast show itself in the column of remarks. In this same year, executions at the central square send many of the dead to nearby grounds, first the Madeleine, then the Aransas field, and before long, Picpus receives rows of bodies in hurried trenches. These interments are swift and without ceremony, arranged to answer immediate needs of space and sanitation, and most of those remains are not destined for the municipal ossuary now. Many will remain where they lie or be disturbed only years hence. You reflect that the city's story of its dead is not a single narrative, but a layered one, and your task is to avoid forcing a single line where the evidence suggests branches. You mark today's date with a clean hand and keep your pen steady when you write. State of preservation inconsistent with long burial, allowing the phrase to sit quietly beneath the official origin. Your training has taught you to value clarity, replication, and the full chain of observation that allows another to follow your path. You measure femoral heads, suture lengths, and dental wear with the same calm sequence you would apply to any lot, because facts arrange themselves best when gathered patiently. Yet you also learn, in these galleries, that institutions speak in summaries, and that summaries favor certain elements over others. The city whispers of efficient solutions below ground, of how the quarries turned ossuary answer sanitary questions without troubling the streets above. And you hear that such traffic is more palatable when described in tonnage than in names. You write without accusation or conclusion, placing each datum in its proper column and resisting any sentence that would overreach what you can verify. Silence, you realize, is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is the shape a record takes when caution and duty meet. Before you finish the sheet, a superior steps into the lamplight with a gentle request that is really a boundary. You are asked for your measurements only, lengths, volumes, counts, without the narrative notes that would accompany them in a full case report. The tone is courteous, and the reason is not named. You understand that in an age that trusts order, numbers travel more easily than context. You copy the figures neatly onto a separate leaf and pass it forward, keeping the analysis in your own ledger as a complete sequence. The gesture is not refusal, merely a division. Public tables for the records office, private pages for the observations that gave rise to the figures. You recognize that the choice to keep the full chain intact, even if only in your possession, is a modest act of fidelity to the method you are sworn to practice. To steady your thoughts, you turn to the work of hands that anchors the mind. You wrap twine around a bundle of tibiae to prevent shifting, knotting it with the same pattern you learned on your first week below. You straighten tags that list cemetery, district, and transfer date, making sure each string lies flat and each card is legible to a tired clerk at the end of a long shift. You use your foot to nudge loose stones out of the walking line and align a stack so that a narrow passage stays clear for the wheelbarrow and the men who push it. In the distance, water ticks from the roof into a small basin, and you count the drips without meaning to as you ease a row into safer balance. These small corrections feel like the simplest form of care, preserving the integrity of the space even as questions rest quietly behind your ribs. The urban administration above you is not idle, and you make space in your notes for the civic scale as well as the skeletal. Officials tally loads by cart and by weight, reinforce galleries with new pillars where the old stone threatens to give, and post plaques at intersections that summarize the origins of the walls on either side. These boards and tablets reassure through their order: name of cemetery, arrondissement, dates of transfer, sometimes even the year of a notable closure. You copy these headings exactly when they intersect your work, then remind yourself in a lower line that a summary, by design, selects what to include. The neat geometry of the stacks renders the chaos of the city manageable, but it also levels the particularities until the bone wall becomes a single surface. Your ledger resists that flattening in its own quiet way, not by telling stories, but by holding enough detail that another pair of eyes could see what you saw. You study the chalk marks one more time, adding a small cross-reference to the crate number, because consistency is the companion of truth. As you close the ledger for tonight, you accept that uncertainty is not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be acknowledged with patience. You cannot write a final origin for these recent bones, and you do not need to do so to keep their record sound. You can keep measurements clean, set dates clearly, and protect the sequence of observation so that it remains intact when the air in the tunnels has changed and the paper has yellowed a shade. A century that claims reason must also choose which facts to illuminate and which to set aside, and you feel that choice in the gentle pressure of the request you received and in the quiet economy of the posted signs. You choose, within your small sphere, to preserve your complete notes even when the tables that leave this corridor carry only fissures. In trusting accuracy as a form of care, you let the ledger become a modest witness, ready for the day when someone asks not only how much was moved, but what, precisely, it was. When the last lamp is capped, you let the galleries settle into their own measured hush, a slow breathing that belongs to stone and water. You stand with your hand on a wall built of tibiae, each bone set like a brick, and you feel the wall's careful weight steady the old quarry void behind it. The stacks are not monuments so much as trusses, a practical geometry that holds the soft ground of Paris in place, so streets do not sag, and cellar walls do not give way. You run your thumb across a chalk mark that says only a letter and a lot number, and you are grateful for the plainness of that code. Rows tallied, corners braced, aisles kept clear so that nothing falls. The beauty here is incidental, a byproduct of consistency, and you know that the grand displays and inscriptions will come in later years, when administrators have time to polish what necessity has made. For now you keep the ledger as your predecessors kept the quarry ledgers, with lines that match the rows you build and numbers that match the bundles you count, because a stable wall is the first courtesy the living can pay the dead. The drip at your shoulder and the slow settling of dust sound like a clock without hands, regular enough that your own breath takes up its pace. The logic of the ossuary reads itself to you in columns and rows, femurs laid parallel in courses, and skulls spaced like fixed points in a proof. You measure length and curvature because numbers let you speak quietly across years, and because a clean column of figures is a promise you can keep. A femur set against your rule suggests a stature, and that estimate becomes a line in the register beside a date and a place of origin, even if the place is listed only as a parish long since levelled. You tie twine around a bundle not to bind it forever, but to keep it together long enough for the wall to hold, the way a sentence holds words for an idea to pass intact. Your apprenticeship has taught you that reason is not thunder but habit, clean hands before and after, a pencil sharpened to a fine point, glass jars labelled with a steady script, and every sum checked twice before you climb the stair. Above you, Paris keeps its own ledgers. Printers feed paper through presses at a patient rhythm. Guards pace their posts with boots striking stones in counted beats, and vendors arrange loaves in rows that please the eye and ease the hand. Even the bells, though their meanings shift, toll the hours in intervals that people can carry from street to street, a public metronome that outlasts the words shouted between one toll and the next. Your notebook lies open on a shelf of limestone, the page catching stray dust like a thin snowfall, and you write as you move, letting your hand record the same plain grace your hands perform. On the line where you keep reflections separate from measurements, you set down a sentence that has been gathering itself under your ribs all evening. These bones are not relics of faith, but of the age that replaced it. They belong to reason, and reason too will crumble. You do not write it as a defiance, only as an observation of the way everything you handle answers to more than one chronology. The years since burial, the years since quarrymen cut these galleries, the months since the city changed its calendar to suit new ideals. The catacombs began as borrow pits for stone that built churches, halls, houses, and bridges for a medieval and early modern city. They now shelter what could no longer be safely kept in churchyards, moved here so that air and water above would run clean. In time, the people who tend this place will add formal inscriptions to these walls and conduct tours, turning storage into instruction so that citizens may pass through, learn, and return to daylight with a new attention. Institutions alter their names and their seals, streets find new titles, and yet the human form remains beneath those shifts, fragile in detail, irregular in proportion, and persistent in its quiet. Hours fold quietly underground, and the galleries accept your presence the way an account accepts a new entry. You recheck your tags, pull a level along a course of tibiae until the bubble steadies, and tap a pair of wedges until the wall holds without strain. The work makes a calm that has nothing to do with sleep. Somewhere above, the city changes its weekdays into 10-day cycles, and you picture a clerk redrawing a calendar grid with the same care you spend realigning a skull so its orbital rims sit square. The order you keep is modest because it must serve weight, the curve of a ceiling that needs shoring, the seam where quarrymen left a pillar, the narrow turn where a lantern once brushed the stone and left soot like a finger trace. In these passages, your rules are a few good inches of clearance, a brace placed where the rock suggests it, a label aligned so that a colleague will not have to guess in the dark. Even the rumor that fresh dead are rooted here collapses into the same obligations once bones arrive. The wall must be sound, the lot must be logged, and the corridor must pass safely from one marker to the next. You move in the half-light with the confidence of someone who trusts procedures not to solve life, but to keep it from slipping, the way a handrail keeps a step from turning into a fall. Toward dawn, you close the ledger and let the echo of your steps join the steady drip, and you climb the stair until cool air grows damp with weather. The streets smell of rain and printer's ink, and limestone dust rinses from window sills into the gutters where water runs in even sheets. Your colleagues are already gathering near the presses, arguing gently about the shape of progress and the right names for the days, their voices curving around hot cups and the clatter of type. You listen with the same attention you bring to a line of bones, hearing how teachers arrange ideas so that students can carry them away, how a law is set in clauses so that a city can live by it. It occurs to you that the livy rearrange the dead for their own instruction, just as they rearrange knowledge for their own understanding, and that nothing in this feels sinister when it is done with care and a clear label. You imagine that your century will be remembered less for what it destroyed than for how carefully it arranged what remained, bones, measures, words, and laws, so that others might study them in their turn and make their own careful ledgers. You close your notebook, return your calipers and rule to their pouch, and step into the measured day with the unhurried certainty that patience and precision are a kind of kindness in any age. Night folds gently over the city, and you accept its quiet as you would a shawl set over tired shoulders. The streets exhale the day's last ink and rain, and your steps become unhurried, measured, almost like an old watch finding its rhythm again. In that steady cadence, your thoughts drift back to the rooms below the earth, where stone and bone have become a language older than debate, older than decree. You have learned to let the mind settle the way sediment settles in a clear jar, grain by grain, until the water is calm. Ideas that aspired to stand like columns reveal themselves as sand, and there is comfort in that knowledge. The body teaches you the same lesson with every rib and curve of skull, that all architecture begins with breath and ends in rest. Reason, when it is at peace, feels less like a blade and more like a lantern, something to carry at arm's length to see the next few steps, then lower when it is time to sleep. A soft drizzle freckles the paving stones, and you pause beneath the modest shelter of a doorway. The bells keep their count, not to command, but to accompany. You think of the careful stacks below, their patience, their refusal to hurry anyone toward an answer. In their company, urgency seems like a passing weather. The lesson they offer is not surrender, but scale. That the human measure is gentle when it remembers how small it is, and how beautifully sufficient that smallness can be. At your window, the garret air is thin and kind, washed with a faint chalk scent that clings like memory. You set down your tools, and with them you set down the need to resolve anything tonight. The world may be arranging itself in new alignments, but your part is simpler: to breathe, to listen, to keep good company with the hour. Knowledge can be a bed, not a battlefield. It can hold the weight of your questions without asking them to march. You stretch your hands, the day loosening like a knot that undoes itself. Somewhere presses will rest. Somewhere lamps will gutter to small suns. Somewhere water will thread through stone in the old patient way. Let it happen. Let the city and its centuries turn their pages without you for a while. You lie back and allow the darkness to become spacious. The bells grow distant, then gentle, then kind. In that widening quiet, the mind closes its ledger and opens its palm. Breath by breath, you enter the one arrangement that needs no argument: the slow, sure order of sleep.